Now I would like to invite Ivan Verbytskyi, director of the Analytical Center of Cedos. Ivan will be talking about the common house reconstruction and housing policy of the future. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm so happy to see everyone. Thank you for coming. And I am going to talk about reconstruction and future housing policy. But to lay the foundation, I would like to share some images with you and try to analyze our past and our conclusions, that lessons learned from our past, thinking about tomorrow. And of course, housing is one of the biggest challenges faced by Ukraine, our communities and towns as a result of this war. And after that, I'm going to share with you my vision or interpretation as of to the principles that we have to bear in mind during the recovery process. The day after tomorrow, on June the 30th, in Mistetsky Arsenal, the exhibition will be closed that will demonstrate the imagery that Ukrainian artists used during the wartime. And one of the objects was created by an art group's 3 exercises of realism, and it belongs to the ceremony for 20. It consists of 3 paintings demonstrating human bodies laying on the floor, and the faces of these people are invisible. And the description to the painting goes that in the evening of February 23, we came back home from our workshop, and for the previous months we were working on creating our paintings, and February 23 was the final day. All 3 paintings were finished, and we were tired and went to bed without any suspicion of the big war coming next day. And we were exploring the sphere of burial business that became a business rejecting humanity. When a homeless person dies, they stay in the morgue, and if no relatives are found, then they are buried. No priests are invited, and the hole in the ground is digged for 15 to 20 people. So for us, it's inhumane because a person deserves decent treatment. After the counteroffensives of Ukrainian armed forces, mass burial places were found, and victims of war are found there, tortured, killed by artillery, or died as a result of the absence of medical assistance. And those burial places repeat these inhumane practices, and this looks like an apprehension of Ukrainian genocide. And this is a poster created by Natalia Shurga and a Danish Mikael Colin Anderson. Probably you heard this name before. This poster can be bought on Redbubble website, and there are 3 figures on this poster, with a woman holding a child by a hand, and then there is a girl with a bicycle on the other side of her, and this lady shows a middle finger, or the pointing finger showed, the middle finger showing Russian planning, go and fuck yourself, and we will rebuild Ukrainian cities. So it's a rephrase of Zmeiny Island Defenders, which gives an answer to the question we are trying to answer in various spheres of our lives, how we should recover and rebuild our city free from Russian imperialism. So how the Verkhovna Rada returned Zvyagil as the name to Novograd-Volynski, but should we start thinking about renaming Odessa, Sevastopol, or Khmelnytsky? Whether it's enough to replace the Soviet coat of arms on the motherland monument. We have construction norms that require that kindergartens should be built separately with sufficient space for playgrounds. Sometimes they also call it a terrible Soviet heritage, because now when we build the kindergartens we should not spend so much space. We can use multi-story buildings. So should we go for decommunization here as well? Or these Russian standards also require sufficient isolation level, and probably those apartments that we are thinking about are not in the best condition. But again, if we have a lot of greenery around the buildings, that maybe this decommunization means a rejection of standards and ensuring that they are aimed at creating better life space. Russian imperialism manifests itself in various ideological forms. The Soviet Union used to be even from the point of view of Marxism, that even the leftist intellectuals criticized it for its authoritarian nature. And at the same time, we have Sweden as a social state that functions in the conditions of competitive market economy. And we read all those beautiful Hugo books. But at the same time, as Russia, they are market economy. But Russia is a very specific form of market economy and very authoritarian ones, where we have this exploitation of natural resources and maximization of enrichment that enables us to call it a radical neoliberal state. It's not only total state regulation, but also a total absence of social solidarity, which is extremity. And if we reject one of them, it should not push us to the other extremity. Europe's recovery after World War II is a good example of development of democratic states with a dialogue between trade union and employers, good construction norms. And being a developed market economy does not mean that everything should be regulated by the market, because the market cannot decide it, because the framework for market functioning is set by the state. And the essence of democracy is that we have to come to an agreement as to the established framework. And we should have sufficient intellectual courage to be able to answer the complex questions related to decommunization. So we now abandon the state plan, but we still develop state strategies. We rename Pushkin Street, but we still use Cyrillics. We are against total state control, but we still have to develop market economy. And there are different types of market economy, different types of socialism, and we have to find our own approach, which taxes we have to pay, and which guarantees we would like to receive from the state. And here, dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to address you. So that's growth of interest in urbanism in Ukraine, what we saw 10 to 15 years ago, was mediated by the Russian interest, because urbanistica is very difficult to translate into English. Now we have urban lifestyle, urban activism, urban studies, but urbanistica or urbanistic can have different meanings related to various activity areas. Sorry about mentioning the country we would like to forget, but this analysis and deconstruction of external influences that we experienced are critically important for us to be able to reject them. So in the beginning, in early 2010s, a new mayor was appointed in Moscow, and the cities was a place of large-scale protests against the developments that were taking place there. And one of the responses to these protests was policy for creating the possibilities for depoliticized activities for the youth, and development of urbanistic programs and urbanistic transformations. And in Moscow today, they have better public transport than in Kiev. And this is the center for, is a city for people, according to Jensen Bian, unlike Ukraine, where this book was published by an independent publishing house. This book, Cities for People, was published by the state. And the author of this book, Yangel, he thanked the Russian government for the possibility to publish his book in Russian. So that it is about the ways of legitimization of the government in the eyes of the population. In Moscow, for instance, they destroyed all those kiosks in the street. They demolished them overnight, whereas in Kiev we still have them. Because if that would have been done here, the people would go to protest and block the Khreshchatyk streets. So we have to think about the ways of making different stakeholders to accept that. Although in the authoritarian regimes, that can be done more easily. And what we call urbanistica came to Ukraine more than a decade ago, wrapped in this depoliticized cover of urban design. But the city for people is not only about urban design. The improvement of urban space and high quality leisure time and absence of the right to vote is a social contract that led the Russian society to the catastrophe which it experiences today, because the city cannot be without a policy. Policy and community is related to political participation and political action. And if we want the comfortable urban environment be based not on authoritarian regime and money of nature resources exploring economy, the way will be longer but more sustainable. Bicycle tracks will be created not by a leader's decision, but it will be result of the pressure from civil society. And for civil society, in the civil society, each bicycle NGO will be counterparted by drivers, automobile drivers NGO. And that's about democracy, when different groups with different interests use their representatives to defend their rights and interests. In democracy, state authorities do not dictate decisions based on their wishes, but they facilitate dialogue among various stakeholders. They listen to everyone, and they are trying to find the optimal solution. Transformations require more time, but they are more sustainable because it's not a decision of one person, but very wide consensus of communities. And that means that the development vector will be changed dramatically.
Ukraine qualitatively is different from Russia because in 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we didn't close the trolleybus and tramway networks if we're not counting the occupied territories. For example, the mayor of Moscow does not have anything keeping him from eliminating the world's largest public transport network. The mayor of Kiev probably maybe would love to do that, but nobody will let him, nobody will allow him to do this. We are not aware enough, educated enough about our transport system. We will fix that. In the authoritarian system in the Russian Empire, it was them who took the historic self-governance in the form of Magdeburg right, Magdeburg law. And coming back to these traditions is what we need to say no to the Soviet and Russian legacy. The competition of ideas, the competition for the votes at the elections, finding compromise by building the strategy of development. This might sound difficult and not very compelling, and our politicians and civil servants are sometimes incompetent and corrupt, but also some of our business and trade unions are, and even some of the priests, activists, civil organizations can be so corrupt and inadequately trained. They might be, but it doesn't mean we can replace all of them by unbiased technocrats that we brought from abroad. That can't be. Appointing CEOs instead of electing mayors is what the Russians used to do. The technocrats is the informal name of the community of professional economists that are ruling the key institutions of Russia that allows this country to accumulate resources for the war against us. Technocracy without the civil control is a direct pathway to a catastrophe. Of course, professionalism is critically important. I work in the think tank and win my money by researching for the good of the government and its decision making, good decision making. But also the analytical research can easily contain manipulations. The way we conduct our research can directly influence the results of that research. We need the variance of institutions that do the research and productive competition amongst the researchers to stimulate the quality and provide triangulation. Another problem of excessive technocratization is the essence of the data. When Khreshchatyk was bringing back the pedestrian crossing, there was a calculation of how long for how long will it slow down the flow of the cars, and then they were taking the decisions. Was it critical for the city or not? Was it desirable or not? Is barrierless environment on the roads the most important thing right now? So based on the values, based on the strategy of development taken by the community of the city, very different decisions can be taken. That's why we need not only professionals, civil servants appointed by their professional merit, but also we need the politicians that are responsible to their electorate. We need that. In Ukraine, there is a lot of room for perfection, but we are developing and further improvement is possible. The key is in our hands. As Viktor Zatov said, the city is its people, less aesthetics, more ethics. We don't only need to discuss the park benches, but the public discussions on should we privatize the infrastructure for private cars, should we deregulate the construction or improve the social housing building. We need the place and the platform for the dialogue. We need to understand how we want to organize our state and local policies in various fields of life. Let's take housing, for example. In the Soviet Union, the housing fund, all of the housing facilities were the property of the government. And then they launched the program of the government housing building, which resulted in the housing that we have in Ukraine right now. It was given free of charge to the citizens. People received this housing, but it was not their private property. The responsibility for servicing of this housing was the government's responsibility. After Ukraine's independence, people received the right to their property by privatization. Around 90% of the housing was privatized according to this policy. On one hand, it gave the people the pillar, the basis for surviving the transformation towards market economy in the 90s. But on the other hand, it didn't solve the housing crisis completely. First of all, not all of the people, not all the citizens had something to privatize, had something in their property. Then, after 1994, new people were being born, surprisingly, and the government did not have any resource for continuing the housing. Private constructors appeared and went into the market. Not everyone has, unfortunately, the resources to buy property or even rent the property. What is to be done with that? Formally, privatization of the housing did not revoke the state system that existed before. You can get into the line to receive the property, and your and your community might, when your turn comes, and give you that property, and you will afterwards privatize it if you want. But the chance that you'll receive this apartment in this line is close to zero. The government and the community have no money to build the property and give it out in this way. Moreover, even if that had happened, the question would be the efficiency and the justice of such policy. The entire society is paying taxes to essentially give as a gift a piece of a property to a family or of a person. This policy is neither social nor liberal. It's nonsense. The system cannot work like that, and it doesn't. We either have great expectations from the state, if we expect it to give us the housing, but the government is supposed to have these resources. But do we want to diminish the role of the government and privatize? But then we have to reduce our expectations. So what do we want? The right-wing policy or the left-wing policy, or a compromise, a centralist compromise? But this cannot be done all at the same time. What we're doing right now, nothing is being done. The system still has some time until it expires. Still have some resources. About 90% of people before the privatization had the housing and property. The problem for national policy was not that pressing, but increasingly more young people came into the market and they did not have anything to inherit. They could not count on anything. Also, occupation makes people leave their houses and become IDPs, and many houses are just physically destroyed. We are waiting for compensation from Russia, but this will not happen anytime soon. Even if the compensation reparations are paid fully, it will take much time. So we must work on creating dignified conditions for housing right now. So mortgage or discount loans for buying property and housing might be the solution. Risks are there. For example, the continued war. We have the air raid siren right now. And even after these risks are mitigated, not everyone will have the chance to buy housing. Like in the Soviet Union, the responsibility of taking care of the housing is on the owners, but the government, the state, is not the owner anymore, it's not the proprietor. We are. We must agree with that we are not very effective users and caretakers of the property. If we compare ourselves to the Baltic country, Germany, Czech Republic, Poland, even if we take the quality of services and the quality of their housing, ours is much lower. Our last year research in Vinnytsia suggests that people are most unhappy about the quality of the housing in our city. We have a pressing need in the subsidies to pay the facilities, because many of the housing items need fixtures every 40 years, and that might cost almost half of their market price. And up until 1990, we paid additionally to accumulate costs that would cover fixing these property items. Even without that, paying for facilities was a challenge. And after some time, these accumulative payments were brought back, but that was voluntary. What's to be done with this? First of all, this can be paid by the government. These costs can be covered by the government, but is that just? Where do we take the costs for that? If I cannot pay for fixing my car, I don't expect the government to pay for that, right? What about subsidies for gas, or receiving a discounted loan, or receiving a car as a gift? No, that's absurd, of course. But the same logic we perceive as quite clear when it comes to propriety. When we talk about the car, we understand that owning it is responsibility and covering the service costs. We don't think that way when we're talking about housing. If I can't afford a private car, I use public transport. Societally, we have agreed that mobility is important, and free movement is one of the key rights of a human that's important to implement the human potential to its fullest. So we use part of the taxes to develop public transport. This is an available option. If you want to pay extra, you pay extra for the comforts. But this basic option is important, so we try to support it and prioritize it. We can use the same logic with the housing. The right to housing is one of the universal rights of a human being. Having a place to live and a roof over your head is important for the economy and the societal life, and develop yourself as a human. So the social housing can be tackled like public transport. If I don't have the resource to use the private transport, I use the public transport. If I don't have a resource to rent or buy or rent an apartment, I can count on social housing. But as we have already found out, we have privatized the entire housing fund in the 1990s. Before the full-scale invasion, the social housing system consisted out of about 3,000 housing items nationwide. In Kiev, there was about 74 apartments for a huge city of 3 million people. Directly speaking, honestly speaking, this system was very marginalized, the social housing system. The procedure of receiving these social housings was very complicated and did not fully cover the needs of the vulnerable groups. But European experience tells us that it should not be so. If we bring together the fully subsidized and the partly subsidized vulnerable groups, we can reach a balance when the system of this social housing is sustainable and will recreate itself in the long run. Such long-term investments can be interesting for a certain niche of the investors. For example, the pension funds, who don't need the skyrocketing incomes, but they need the stability of their incomes. It can also suggest sustainable options for people who are not in the vulnerable categories already, but still don't have the resources to buy property, an apartment or a house, or cover it by a loan. If we agree that Ukraine needs this system, I would suggest that we give it a good thought. We need to make a number of steps.
We'll have to revise the legislative framework and revisit the state programs. And instead of dispersing scarce resources among many programs, we have to structure them into a clearly defined program with priorities. And then we will have to create a framework for operators of social housing, and they provide for a mandatory reinvestment to ensure sustainability of the system and audit of the implemented programs, and then all the queues should be combined into a single register. We have to create a national housing agencies that would support public, municipal, and private operators of social housing. And then we would like to bring together the state's housing programs that are now dispersed among various ministries, and they should be structured in structured program. And this example can be a wonderful illustration of three important principles which I would like to discuss with you. First of all, it's a responsibility for yourself and your property, ability to bear the responsibility and perform your duties, understanding the boundaries of your responsibility and the responsibility of the state, community, or a local self-government body, and mutual responsibility among various state agencies. It's not enough just to declare that the responsibility is with local communities if they have no money to develop this housing sector. Even if they have success stories in some towns, the role of the state is to support those who for various reasons do not do so well. Responsibility, it's not only thinking about today, but thinking about the entire life cycle of some facility, decision, or policy. With regard to housing, we have to think like who will repair it, how it will be repaired, what will happen to it 20 years later. Every decision we take today about housing or recovery ideally should not respond only to our urgent need of today, but we have to remember about long-term consequences. Maybe in the shorter term it is more convenient to do something, but if we think in terms of decades, then something else should be done. For instance, monetary compensation to those who need it, covering renting housing in a private sector looks a good decision even now, yeah, when we don't have this social housing at the moment, and it requires a lot of time to construct it. But if we count compensations and the cost it requires for many years, then this amount would be enough to construct social housing. And instead of pouring this money into a bottomless bucket, we could use it to create housing for those who are waiting in a queue. Another important aspect is the climate change, which cannot be rejected any longer. In Ukraine, it's difficult to think about it during the wartime. In the rest of the world, people start thinking about longer-term impact of actions, and we should think about that as well. The second principle I wanted to suggest is solidarity. In one way or another, we are in the same boat. We cannot build a closed housing complex and live there happily, not thinking about any social problems. If we fail or find ourselves in difficult life circumstances, each of us will face the risk of being outside this boat without a life-saving belt. And these social inequalities can lead to political radicalization and sympathies to ideologically radical parties, or this throwback to authoritarian regime. Solidarity is about ethics and decency, because this Russian aggression was a response to the revolution of decency in 2014. Human decency works only when it's universal. And when the protesters were beaten on the Maidan, it was not a crime against decency of these people, dignity of these people, but it was about dignity of others, because if you can do that to them today, then you can do the same to me tomorrow. And if there is no social response to the situation when people live in decent conditions, then that means that it's acceptable for everyone. Solidarity and unprecedented mobilization of support became the response of Ukrainian society to the full-scale invasion, and that helped our country to resist. People offered shelter, food, they helped strangers. We were able to activate huge power, but unfortunately, functioning of our state today does not use this power. And it looks like it's time for us to think about institutionalization of this solidarity, to find ways for it to work not only in crisis situation, but be efficient in our everyday lives, especially where the current state machinery fails to perform its tasks. And the third principle is freedom. Freedom means that I suggest we think about freedom as of the possibility of each and every person to fulfill their potential, to become what they want to be, regardless of what other people think about it. Freedom is important for development. Freedom is about the right to make a mistake, to experiment, and have a system for support, a system of support for emergencies. So it's like insurance. If we want every person to have a possibility to fulfill their potential, this system should be universal and accessible for everyone. Usually we receive this support from family or friends, but not all of us have them, and not all of them can support us. On Tuesday, I went to a supermarket and I was trying to find lemon juice. And an elderly lady approached me. She was very neatly dressed, and she had a backpack, and she asked me to buy a loaf of bread for her and maybe a bottle of water. And then she said, "Can I ask something else from you?" She said, "I haven't eaten sausages for so long. Could you buy them for me? Or maybe something else? Maybe cheese, sour cream, anything else? And one banana. Maybe you need anything else. Maybe potatoes, some tomatoes, an onion. And then she said, oh, it's a lot. That's it. Or maybe one candy. I haven't eaten them for such a long time. Freedom is a situation when you are not hungry, despite whether there are kind people in supermarket, or maybe if we look in a way that people are ready to support us. We lived through the famine, great famine, and our best memory is about this strategy is to create a situation when no one dies from hunger anymore. And we cannot be the Russians for ourselves, for our people. Our freedom is a possibility to create a welfare country, a country where every person is treated with dignity, and where no one is treated in an inhuman way, the way we see now in the liberated territories. In one of the towns, my colleagues talked to homeless people, and they said that during the first month after the full-scale invasion was the best time for them. So it was the most difficult time for the majority of us, but for them, for someone, it was the easiest. Because in March 2022, homeless people were able to receive necessary things, shelter and food. In different countries, homeless people face different scale of problems depending on the state policy. State policies can be changed. Democracy is the tool for such changes. We have this tool to make our society and our state stronger, and let us use it. Let us stay together and stick to each other. Thank you.